We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Energy Changemakers podcast. I'm Elisa Wood, your host. And I have with me today Bill Prindle of Better Energy Advisors. Bill is a well-known senior energy and climate leader. He's got 40 plus years in the industry, working with ICF Consulting, ACEEE, the Alliance to Save Energy, among others. His expertise spans policy, technology, markets, and programs, and he's worked with governments, nonprofits, the private sector, and other entities. I've known Bill for years. He's a member of our community here at Energy Changemakers. And one thing I've noted many times about Bill is his ability, because of the work he's done, to understand the industry from both the distributed energy and the utility perspective. That's rare. Utilities tend to see DER companies as a threat or perhaps as not understanding their role and obligations. DER companies say that utilities are obstructing new technologies, change, and progress. And since Energy Changemakers is a community devoted to the advancement of DERs, you can pretty much guess where most people in the community stand. But when we're meeting in the community and talking about this stuff, Bill will often step back in a very reasoned way, explain both perspectives. This is important, right? Distributed energy providers and utilities both have roles to play on the electric grid, roles that are evolving, so they need to get to know each other. They're going to have to play together, like it or not. They're going to be working together for the foreseeable future. So I asked Bill to be on the show today to tell us what he thinks that utilities don't get about distributed energy companies and should, and vice versa, what distributed energy companies don't understand about utilities, but should. So let me introduce you now to Bill. Hello, Bill. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Lisa. It's my pleasure.
So I've always, as I said, been fascinated by our discussions in the community because you really do bring a unique perspective. You're able to point out both sides of this kind of ongoing argument we seem to have within the energy industry these days. So let me start just by asking you, from the distributed energy perspective, what is it that they're not seeing about utilities? What do you run into that you find, they just don't understand this perspective?
Yeah, great question. And there's a lot of answers. The way I primarily look at this is through the lens of how investor-owned utilities make money. So I think a lot of folks know that about 75% of the customer loads in the US are served by investor-owned companies. The rest are served by municipal utilities, public power districts, rural co-ops, and so on. IOUs, as they're called, make up the bulk of the electric utility industry. And the way their earnings are determined is still primarily based on physical assets that are deemed used and useful by regulators and placed in what's called the rate base, right? The asset collection on which utility regulators allow utilities to make a rate of return. Every pole and transformer and substation, switch gear set, and all of those things, all the meters, all the trucks, all the tools that a distribution utility maintains, not to mention the power plants and the transmission lines. Those are physical assets that, depending on how the utility is regulated, go into something called the rate base. And let's say the utility is allowed to earn maybe 10% annual return on those assets. Earnings are, from the investor's point of view, are the mother's milk. That's what the C-suite has to see and wants to see. And I say that partly because when I was at ACEEE, this is almost 20 years ago, EPA and Department of Energy co-sponsored an effort called the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, where they wanted to build some consensus around how to advance energy efficiency as one of the main categories of distributed energy resources. And the co-chair of that committee was Jim Rogers, chairman of Duke Energy, the number 2 carbon emitter in North America at that time. And in one meeting that was off the record, he really boiled it down. He said, look, I just need to show my investors an earnings curve, right? Just like any other CEO. And if I can do that with energy efficiency or renewable energy, I'm all in, right? I'm just limited by tradition and by regulatory practices and by what the different stakeholders in the rate making process will allow. And so that's always stayed with me as if you're an investor in utility, you need to see your earnings grow. And for your earnings to grow, the assets that go into rate base grow. And distributed energy resources come onto the system and they are not owned by the utility. And in some cases, if they are reducing electricity sales, that is a financial loss from the investor owned utilities point of view because the way rates are made in most states, and rate making is a whole topic we could spend 5 other podcasts on, the way asset fixed costs are recovered is through what's typically called volumetric rates. So if you have $1 billion worth of fixed costs of assets, and let's say you have $10 billion in electricity sales, each one of those kilowatt hour sales has to recover a little bit, maybe 10 cents worth of your assets. If those sales go down, all of a sudden, fixed costs are not being fully recovered. And that's financially a problem. A lot of states have dealt with that through rate making reforms like decoupling of sales and revenues. And that's a whole topic that we could talk about for some time.
Mhm.
But it still comes down to this question of earnings growth. So when you look at a state like New York, which went and is still going through a long process originally called Reforming the Energy Vision or REV, in most cases, DER assets are primarily allowed to be earned by non utilities because policymakers wanted to give other folks a shot, right? And it's a complicated policy space in New York, and I don't want to oversimplify it. But the way it tends to be evolving is that utilities might earn some assets and they might not own others. And that's really a key thing. There is a broader movement to shift rate making practices somewhat away from this volumetric pricing model where fixed costs are recovered through each individual kilowatt hour. And the concept of performance based rate making is moving forward in some states. But still, PBR tends to be a modifier, an adder, a subtractor from the fundamental formula of earnings based on assets. So the fundamentals are still there at heart. And DER companies just need to understand that if you're going to be reducing cost recovery, reducing electricity sales, and keeping utilities from adding new assets to their rate base, it's frustrating. It runs against the business model. And certainly business models are trying to be evolved, but some fundamentals still persist. It's also true that we have not one national utility DER market. We have at least 50.
Right. So it's hard to talk in generalities because, as you said, New York's doing something, and another state's doing something else, and some are more evolved than others in terms of trying to figure out how to solve this basic problem, which almost sounds like an existential threat to utilities because if they are dependent on building assets and dependent on earnings from electricity sales, and DERs are coming along, intruding upon that, taking that away, that's a real business problem for them.
Yeah, and if you look at the gas industry, there's a whole other set of problems there with declines in sales and assets that are potentially stranded. So, a lot
Hmm.
of states are trying to restrict sales of natural gas and other fossil fuels. And in fact, if you look at sales per customer, the natural gas industry has been seeing small but measurable declines in average sales per customer in, I'll say, in many markets, if not everywhere, partly because of people like me who spend a lot of time on building energy codes and appliance efficiency standards and utility DSM programs that have helped reduce demand. So
Mhm.
when you look at energy codes today, they're, roughly speaking, they're twice as stringent as they were 30 years ago, right? So homes are not using as much gas for heating and so on. So compared to the electricity industry, the gas industry has substantially greater challenges.
And then there's the whole electrification issue, right? That's good for the electric companies, but it's very bad for the gas companies.
Right, right. And electrification is a potential disruptor, potential win win opportunity in that as heat pumps for heating and EVs for transportation and heat pump water heaters and induction ranges and those kind of devices come into the buildings sector in significant numbers, utility electricity sales will start to go up, and that will increase revenues in the short term. It's also, I think, helpful to distinguish between kind of the long term view of asset and earnings growth and the short term view. So that brings up things like load factor, right? So if a utility has 1,000 megawatts of generating capacity and only really uses about an average of 650 of those in a year, that's a 65% load factor. So the 35% of their assets are not being used. And you can't earn anything. Well, you can, but the fundamental economics are better for electric utility when its load factor is higher. So if you have a DER future in which you have more electric heating during winter nights. You have electric vehicle charging that is managed time wise, so it's mostly off peak. And if you can create load flexibility through smart thermostats and water heater controls, a utility can see total electric sales go up, and also they can see the load factor improve. So that in the short term, that definitely helps everything. The other thing about sits behind load factor is reliability, right? Load flexibility through demand response, through like battery DER strategies where batteries can selectively be discharged to support the grid. That can support reliability, and reliability almost trumps everything else. It never fails when reliability experiences a really bad setback. Boy, utility executives get pounded. Nobody likes the power to go out. And so anything that can be shown to keep the lights on, and there are specific indices, SAIDI and SAIFI, these specific SAIDI and SAIFI, those are used to measure utility performance. That's one flavor of performance based rate making, right? So, electrification with demand flexibility and some DER grid support, that can increase sales for the utility, improve load factor for the utility, and improve reliability. If that you can get all three of those things working together, there can be some win-win space there.
That's certainly reliability is a big area for DERs. As soon as you see these reports about the outages, things like Hurricane Beryl, immediately see the DER industry come out and say, hey, look what we did. We kept the lights on over here at this hospital or at this school or wherever. So I think that it's interesting because I think some of these places where utilities falter are places where DERs can really shine. And I think in terms of electrification, the DER industry sees itself as another way to fulfill those new needs that are occurring because of electric cars and because of data centers and that sort of thing. So it's an opportunity for the utilities, but the DER industry would say also it's an opportunity for us. So that's an interesting time. But what I'd like to get into is how do we even get here? This is a funny place to be, isn't it? We have these utility industry in the US based, as you said, it's models based on assets and earnings. Yet we have this other upstart industry coming up, which could erode those assets and earnings. Yet at the same time, we require these utilities to be reliable. What's the history that got us here?
Yeah,
How did we get so fragmented?
yeah. Yeah, so back in the 19th century, when electric generation first became a viable thing from an engineering and economic perspective, there were no utilities. Thomas Edison famously opened the Pearl Street station in New York City in the early 1880s. But really, the first DER developers were industrial plants, right? If you wanted to open a steel mill or textile mill, whatever, you had to build your own boiler and you had to put in your own dynamo, maybe using steam from the boiler to run a turbine, depending on the technology of the day. Those were some of the first microgrids, if you will. Those industries had little choice. There was a lot of enthusiasm when New York State built the first major hydro facility at Niagara Falls right around the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, somewhere in there. And the deal then was industries could just sign up with a single fixed payment to help pay off the bonds that were used to build the hydro plant. And then they had no bills. The
Mm.
hydro plant just ran and they had quote unquote free electricity. That got the attention of a lot of industrial leaders like, oh, really? These utilities can sell it to us cheaper? And so, there evolved during the first few decades of the 20th centuries utilities of types like the New York Power Authority was and remains a publicly owned state chartered utility that developed Niagara Falls. But to really mobilize the capital and build out these expensive grids, only some cities had the capacity to do that. So that's why we have 75% of the utility business in the US today is investor owned because that kind of private capital could be mobilized at larger scale and faster. We, still do have big munis, City of Austin, LA, Seattle, and many others. There is one state that has no investor-owned utilities, and that's Nebraska. Little,
I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
but most states do have at least some investor-owned utilities.
So Nebraska is all public power utility?
Yeah, a lot of that was hydro. The Theodore Roosevelt became a big hydro proponent when he was in office in the first decade of the 20th century because he realized the West would not be able to be developed without that kind of electricity resource and that kind of water for irrigation as well, right? So some of the first big water projects got started then, but they really went on steroids during FDR's time in the 1930s with the rural electrification, Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power Authority, and so on. So there have been major public power efforts, and depending on what region you go to, you'll still see a lot of influence from those. But I have to say, the economics still work in similar ways. There's not quite the same high level financial set of factors that govern publicly owned utilities, but they still have to keep the lights on while recovering their costs and all that. So there are some fundamentals that do apply.
But they tend to be, am I correct in saying they tend to be more open to the idea of DER projects?
Well, can be. They're also, depending on the location that they're at, they can have more regulatory flexibility, right? In a lot of states, utility regulators are pretty mother may I about what utilities are allowed to do.
Mm.
And a a lot of those issues get fought out in judicial proceedings at the Utility Commission. But the other thing that's happened in the last 30 years is the restructuring of utilities that started in the 1990s. A lot of thinkers in the US noticed what was happening in England and Australia and some other places where privatization had begun to sweep various industries. And so, California was the first state to formally restructure its electricity business such that companies could own generation. Transmission systems would be operated by independent system operators, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission refers to as regional transmission organizations, RTOs. And then in the states that chose to restructure, became essentially distribution companies, sometimes called wires companies, right? So Half the states have gone through that restructure.
They can't own generation or operate generation plants in general, correct? That's the
Right.
what defines a restructured state is that part of the business is now open to competition.
Right. And states did it differently. Like in some states like Pennsylvania and Texas, every retail customer had to choose a new unregulated or less regulated power supplier. And it was a bit chaotic because they had to set up systems for like monthly financial settlements between these power marketers, and the utilities were still sending the bills to the customer, but some
Mhm.
parts of the bill were coming from this other entity, right? So,
Confusion.
yeah, and
Lots of customer confusion.
other states had more of an opt-in approach where if you want to select a competitive provider, you can, but your utility will offer you standard offer or default service, as it was often called. States had different flavors, and that's added another layer of fragmentation to the industry, right? So retail distribution electric utilities are still regulated by state utility commissions, but the prices charged by power plants that are no longer utility owned, those are governed by competitive markets. So in this region, I live in Virginia, PJM, which used to stand for Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. PJM is one of the largest RTOs in the country, and they dispatch privately owned distribution companies. Are the load serving entities as they're called, and they distribute the power to the retail customer. But within PJM, you have any number of different regulatory schemes in a given state. So Virginia does not have retail choice competition, whereas Maryland does. So it's become more challenging than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, we were talking about that it was 50 states, but it is 50 states all doing something different. And then you
Right.
have this additional division of the restructured versus the states that didn't restructure and how differently they operate and how differently they treat markets. This reminds me of something, it's a little bit off topic, but I really want to ask you this question because it's something that I've thought about and wondered about a lot. So, back in the days when all of this restructuring was just beginning, I remember independent power producers were very involved in pushing for restructuring, and utilities at that time were against it for the most part. And there was a big battle going on. And I remember there was one environmental group, one environmentalist in particular, I remember, who was really pushing for restructuring. And I said to him, what are you doing here?" I said, "I don't understand. We're talking about fossil fuel providers who want to come in and operate independently. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it wasn't the place you would expect to see an environmentalist. You wouldn't expect to see environmentalists siding with that group of people." And he said, "This is the beginning for solar and all of the, at the time we used the word alternative energy, of all of the alternative energy options. This is what's going to begin us getting on that path." And I've often thought about that because look at where we are now. Oh my God, we have this proliferation of all these alternatives, all this distributed energy. Do you think, here's my question to you, do you think that it was restructuring that prompted this big explosion of new technologies?
Was certainly a factor. The original legal authority came out of the Public Utility Regulatory Practices Act of 1978 during the Carter years when I started in this business.
Is that
Uh,
PURPA? PURPA we hear about?
yeah, so PURPA,
Mhm.
among other things, there's a lot of parts to PURPA, but for the first time, it allowed independent power producers to sell into regulated utility systems. Making that happen on the ground was a long, slow, and painful process because, for the reasons I cited before, utilities did not want to lose that. They did not want to lose control of assets that way. So there were various barriers, connection fees, and so forth, that were used to slow down the deployment of independent power producers. Um, But restructuring certainly was a big factor. The role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is also important. though, because FERC regulates the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, and starting with, I want to say it was Commissioner Chairman John Wellinghoff, again about 20 years ago. When did he come in? 2007 or 8. He really started pushing demand response in particular, and
Mhm.
FERC started really leaning hard on the RTOs to make demand response markets really work. And similar dynamic there, like in RTOs, the owners of the generation capacity, the owners of the transmission assets, they have a lot of influence in the way RTOs think and make decisions. They're the biggest stakeholders, right? The people that own the big assets have a say in things. And so
Sure.
demand response was kind of annoying to generators because in these wholesale markets, when price spikes, like on a hot day in a summer like this, every single generator selling into that market gets a windfall. Prices are up in the hundreds of dollars per megawatt hour. Everybody gets that price. And it's like, this is great. If you're a generation,
Mhm.
yeah, come on. We'll keep the lights on, but yeah, we need to be paid to make sure we're getting every last kilowatt hour to the market. And demand response, and to a lesser extent, energy efficiency in a more passive and longer term way, they dampen that effect. And boy, the studies that have been done show that even a modest amount, a few percentage points off of peak load, can drive down wholesale prices substantially. So demand response was not welcomed with open arms.
And it wasn't the utilities that were having a problem with it, it was the generators, the independent generators who could make money in the
Well,
market,
and
right? Is that
those were demand response programs that were run at the wholesale level, right? So that was really mostly a commercial and industrial market where companies like Enernoc and Sea Power and
Mhm.
others go to large energy users and in many cases aggregate them and then sign up for the RTO's demand response program, and under peak conditions, depending on the program specs, they would sell capacity back into the market, and that was a winner from their perspective. So, in some cases, distribution utilities that have customer load management, like in the old days, it was like radio switches on air conditioners outside the
Hmm.
house, right? Radio switches would cycle off the compressor of the air conditioner. Those programs go back 40 years or more. And, utilities had hundreds of thousands of customers in some cases on those programs individually. Some of those programs, those demand response decrements can be sold into some of the RTO markets as well. That's one of the ways that virtual power plants can operate today with things like smart thermostats. It's a lot easier to aggregate those kinds of load flexibility technologies. And depending on what state you're in and whether you're in an RTO or not, like not all of the US, not even a majority of the states are under a FERC approved RTO regime. So, that's another patchwork overlay, right? Well, if you're in an
Mm.
RTO like PJM, they have this DER and demand response program. But if you're in Colorado, not the same deal.
So if you're going back to the asset earnings model, where does a virtual power plant or demand response come into play here? It seems to me if I were a utility, I would not like these companies because they're taking away my ability to build more assets, right? Because if I don't need to build more assets to meet that peak, I can't get earnings on the assets. And that's what they're basically one of the things they're interrupting, correct?
Well,
They're getting in the way of
this
that.
is where reliability and load factor and system operations economics come into play, right? So if you're trying to avoid outages from summer needle peaks, those hours are a pretty limited number of hours, right, in a given year, typically. The revenue loss to the utility is not that great, and the value of avoiding an outage is infinitely greater.
Because basically you would have diesel generators for that fine those
Yeah,
fine
or,
points, those
or peaking combustion turbines, and those assets they're not necessarily as highly valued because they only operate a few few hours a year. I mean, if an asset can be gotten into rate base, generally speaking, an investor-owned utility will say we're all for that. They're under pressure to show that they're minimizing system costs. So the other thing we haven't talked about is integrated resource planning. So in the grand sweep of utility history, for most of the 20th century, economies of scale were operating as utility grids were built out, as electric loads were coming online, as more and more homes and businesses, various electric devices. And so what utility commissions mostly presided over was rate decreases because the systems were getting bigger, economies of scale were coming in, the marginal cost was dropping, inflation was not a thing, fuel prices were cheap, right? A lot of cheap fossil fuels around.
Hmm.
And then somewhere around 1970, economies of scale peaked out from an engineering point of view. Like, in other words, the US grid was so mature that it wasn't automatically going to be an economic good thing to add more load to the system. And then during the 70s, you had several factors come to play. So it's hard to put it all in one sentence, but the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act all came into place. All of a sudden, utilities were having to comply with environmental regulations. You had the energy crises, starting with the OPEC embargo of 1973, so that, oil prices went up, environmental regulations began to drive up coal prices, and so on and so forth. And then you also had 3 Mile Island, which put a big blow or a big dent in the ambitions for nuclear power. Nuclear power was
Hmm.
going to be a clean, cheap savior, but the cost of nuclear skyrocketed, partly because of safety and other regulations from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But the 70s completely disrupted the otherwise sort of peaceful growth of the US electricity business. So regulators were struggling all during that decade and into the 80s with what do we do to make this thing work again? And integrated resource planning came along as this way of looking at all resource choices, whether it's traditional generation, energy efficiency, demand response, or what have you. And, if you do some detailed analysis over a period of 10 to 20 years, you should be able to come up with an integrated resource plan that produces the least cost set of resources to deliver electricity to customers. And so IRP opened the door for environmentalists and others to get involved in utility regulatory proceedings, right? And
Hmm.
so a lot of the first DSM programs were created because advocates came in and said, look, this is cheaper per levelized kilowatt hour than your generation options, and you should include efficiency and demand response and so on and so forth.
And that's become important to independents, to DER companies, because if there's going to be a place where you're going to find opportunity within a utility territory, it's going to probably be with that integrated resource plan. It's going to show you where they could use DERs over
Right,
here or
right.
whatever. Yeah,
The
yeah.
thing about
Demand
IRP,
response. Or,
one of the limitations of IRP is that it was pretty high level and pretty aggregated. In other words, tended to sort of look at the generation market as a whole and the demand side of the market as a whole and say, oh, we could do this many kilowatt hours of energy efficiency and that many kilowatts of demand response and this many megawatts of renewables and this many megawatts of natural gas, and we'll have a great system if we do that. But DER, being distributed, right?
mm-hmm,
DER requires you to get into distribution system planning, which is different than IRP was traditionally practiced, right? Because IRP developed when
hmm.
every investor in utility in the US was vertically integrated. They owned the generation, they owned the transmission, they owned the distribution. And so everything fit in one big resource box, right? But with
Yep.
restructuring in half the states and the nature of DER, you have to look in a very granular way at the distribution system. So down to the individual feeder and circuit level. Um, and because when you start getting two-way power flows at any scale, the distribution system can incur limits, like voltage variations can't be beyond certain levels, right? So if you have too many resources pushing power back into the grid on a given feeder, you got to manage that. Otherwise, you're going to have issues with voltage.
It's a lot more complicated. It really does.
Right.
And it makes me think of how can you possibly do a 20-year plan now with all this change?
Yeah.
I want to jump into another
Sure.
area because I think it's a really important one. We hear about it all the time, a conflict between utilities and DERs, and that has to do with interconnection.
Mm,
So, what is it that DER companies need to understand? I mean, this is what they understand. They understand that they apply and they can't get in and it takes forever. And, we recently wrote about New Hampshire, which I think some of the companies were waiting 2 years to get their
yeah.
solar projects on the distribution grid. So, what's happening there? What's happening from the utility perspective there?
There's two things. One is if you're trying to interconnect at wholesale grid level, you've got to deal with the RTO or the independent system operator or the utility of record, depending on what part of the country you're in. And because those are typically big systems and there's a lot of renewables being developed out there, there is a backlog. It's
It's like 2 years, I think, from what I read
right,
recently.
right. Now at the distribution utility level, most
Hmm.
states have come up with for solar like net metering rules where, yep, you got to have this kind of meter installed, you got to have this kind of inspection, this kind of inverter is allowed, that kind of inverter is not. Most states have worked that out so that connecting an individual building solar array is hopefully not that long. Sometimes it does take utility inspectors a while, but it's also true that local governments have to inspect these things. In some cases, local governments are more strapped than utilities. So,
This is really a manpower kind of thing, local governments, utilities not having the manpower for the big influx of distributed solar that's coming our way or come our way.
yeah. So yeah, that's a challenging factor. There are efforts underway to streamline, but there is this sort of general question of will we get operational problems emerging if we're randomly allowing too many DERs on the same distribution feeder or circuit,
Mm.
right? And
Hmm.
so it does take some analysis. My sense is that a lot of good folks are working hard to standardize the specifications of devices under IEEE standards and so on. And as utilities develop and implement more advanced distribution automation systems, they'll have an easier time seeing and understanding the behavior of those devices. I have some hope there that something like the equivalent of the USB port will evolve so that it'll be easier for utilities to understand what they're getting and to streamline approvals and then also just to begin to dispatch these resources in larger scale.
So it's a technology problem too. The technology hasn't matured to the point where we have that USB yet to plug and play with a lot of these DERs.
Yeah, there's also concerns about cybersecurity. Some smart technologies have been hacked because they weren't very well protected. There's no indication that that led to a utility operational breach or data breach. But the more devices you have connected to a utility system, the more the cyber worries go up. Not to mention the privacy issues. Utility commissions are hyper focused on protecting customers. And so there's just a lot of nervousness about, well, are we creating, privacy problems or worse, cybersecurity problems for the grid if we connect too much stuff too fast without due diligence, right?
Hmm.
With the Energy Star program, Energy Star Buildings relies on Portfolio Manager, which is a benchmarking tool for energy use. And Energy Star has helped a number of utilities develop data access portals to their system, where if you have your account number and some login credentials, you can go and
Hmm.
get your data electronically. So there are solutions being worked out. It's just they're not completely standardized for the country. There were, during the Obama years, the Green Button Initiative was created to try
Hmm.
to standardize data exchange just for billing data, and that it,
Hmm.
it made some inroads, but we have 50 states and almost 200 investor-owned utilities. So,
Right. What can a DER company do? Do you have any recommendations? I'm applying for interconnection. Is there any way I can approach the utility in a way that will make them perhaps more receptive to me or not get me knocked behind in the line somewhere? Any advice that you'd have for
well,
them?
um, the reality is that it's all local, especially with DER. You got to deal with the entity that you want to provide your solution to, whether it's a distribution company or an RTO or an ISO. Aggregators are coming along, which is promising. And one of the next waves that FERC is pushing is under FERC Order 2222. They're requiring RTOs to accommodate DER aggregators the way that demand response programs were required to be accommodated. So,
Mhm.
again, a lot of TBDs there, but FERC Order 2222 could be a force that will drive at least wholesale level DER aggregations. And DOE and the Loan Programs Office is already funding a number of virtual power plant providers. So, that space is heating up.
Hey everyone. So that was part one of my interview with Bill Prindle. We looked at what DER companies don't get about utilities. In part two, we'll talk about what utilities don't get about DER companies. So go to energychangemakers.com and sign up for our free newsletter to be notified when we post part two. See you then. Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.